This is the second in a four-part series going over the common myths, lies, and misconceptions within the canon of Marxism-Leninism. Today we will be going over the Soviet collectivization drive and the Holodomor famine. In the late 20s, the USSR began a rapid collectivization of agricultural output in the rural breadbasket regions of the Union, most famously Ukraine. The government did this by consolidating individual peasant holdings into large state-controlled collective farms to increase agricultural productivity and requisition grain for distribution. But the process was fast-paced and poorly managed by the central authorities. In the ensuing years, shortages would begin to add up, leading to a mass famine which killed upwards of 7 million people. The famine which affected Ukraine is commonly referred to as Holodomor, of which around 3 million people perished. The Holodomor, like Molotov-Ribbentrop, holds a special point of discussion when it comes to defending Soviet actions. Various degrees of apologia are utilized to downplay the faults of Soviet mismanagement. At one end, you'll get people outright denying that any famine even occurred, which was the official policy of the USSR. In the middle, you might hear something like, it occurred, but it was smaller than popular projections state, and that it was more a result of bad weather as opposed to Soviet actions. And on the opposite end, you might hear that it occurred, it was due to Soviet actions, but that it was necessary, and that it did not constitute a genocide as commonly asserted. Unfortunately, what we see here is an observable trend of historic negation. Whilst they might appear contradictory, it's possible for all of these claims to be used interchangeably depending on the context of discussion. So, all of the above is an option as well. Let's say that you contend that the Holodomor was not a genocide, but rather an unintentional consequence of collectivization. Well, congratulations. So does a lot of modern scholarship. The genocide question is the only main thing that has any contention amongst historians. But it's a common act for many naysayers to use this quote-unquote debate as a way to ignore the actual stuff that happened, and instead quickly slam down statements of confusion and denial. Whether there was any intent of wanton destruction or not is, for the purposes of the end results, largely irrelevant. The actions of the leadership still showcase a clear disregard for human casualties and a total ignorance to the desires and different ways of life of the people involved, instead putting justification on the necessity of industrialization. In some ways, you could say that the collectivization period contains some parallels with the enclosure movement in England, whereby common land was gradually fenced off and people who were now without means of production had no choice but to work for the industrialists. In the modern day, these measures are often justified post hoc by liberals based on the results we see today.
It's a small wonder that Malthus only saw the downside of the agricultural revolution. Only through historical hindsight do we know that private property accelerated incentives to experiment with new methods of food production, which dramatically increased the amount of food produced. Like before enclosure, it wouldn't have made sense for someone to buy a seed press and plant neat rows of seeds because anybody with a cow could have trampled on them an hour later. The lower food prices created by more food supply began to ease the cycle of misery that Malthus described, although only just barely.
But this is a dangerous logical road to go down, as it presents the ends as justifying the means after the fact. We see this same parallel with the Soviet example. I don't find the statement that collectivization was necessary to be a particularly solid one. It might come across as a bit perplexing for some socialists for me to say that. Certainly I'm not against improvements in living standards, but industrialization is not the be-all and end-all of that. I understand, though, that this is dependent upon your political standards and whether you consider state measures legitimate or not. Yet even if we did maintain the premise that collectivization was necessary, it does not conclude that what occurred had to do so in the way that it did. The common source for many Holodomor narratives comes from a book called Fraud, Famine, and Fascism, by Canadian Union organizer Douglas Tottle. The book is nearly 40 years old by now, and predates the opening of the Soviet archives, which makes it a highly unreliable source. And if you've got a keen eye, you'll notice that this book is a spectacular example of spilling red herrings. The first story tells of a man by the name of Thomas Walker, who from Tottle's narrative was apparently the first main popularizer of the Ukrainian famine in the West. Walker allegedly went to the Soviet Union in late 1934. After a few weeks, he left via the eastern border with China. A few months later, in January 1935, Walker was in Chicago, where he published several articles in the Hearst newspaper group, detailing an apparent first-hand account of the ongoing famine. But many contemporary journalists were skeptical of this nobody's story and background. In the ensuing weeks, it was revealed that Thomas Walker was in fact career conman Robert Greene, who was currently on the run after having escaped prison some years prior. He would later admit that all of the photos that he used in his articles were fakes. On the surface, it would appear as though this was case closed, as it was a complete act of opportunism and sabotage. Except that's clearly not all there is to it. Greene's papers were released in 1935. What the narrative conveniently leaves out is that other reporters had already been documenting the famine in the 2 years prior. It was pretty well known about by that point, the most notable of which being Gareth Jones, the actual original first-hand reporter to the West. He and Walter Duranty had already been having their beef well before any 6 million figures reached the Hearst press. And he had also recently written some further reports on the famine just a month prior to Greene's, and they were met with radio silence from any Soviet-affiliated group. But that isn't the information you'll get when buying into this book's narrative. Let's just focus on Robert Greene. He lied. Gareth Jones, well, here's an out-of-context photo of him with the Nazis, so yeah, he's a Nazi. Therefore, Holodomor is a hoax, or exaggeration, or CIA, whatever, I don't care. Just stop talking about it. It's very convenient. It's not a surprise then that some have considered Greene to be a Soviet fall guy, used to discredit American reporting on the famine. I'm not going to state whether I believe that or not. I don't really care. But I do know that historically speaking, it wouldn't be that surprising. The book then discredits innumerable false photographs which were used by yellow press journalism due to the lack of actual photos being available. The lack of photographic evidence, and indeed the use of wrong-era photographs, is something that might also catch you off guard. If this famine were so large, then why is so little to showcase for it? But it's not quite as significant as you might think. As a comparison, the Nazis were quickly overrun and kept large documentation of all their crimes. This was then quickly found and the information disseminated across by the victors. The USSR, on the other hand, had decades to cover up, restrict, and destroy any evidence of such a tremendous event. As I hinted at earlier, it was the official policy of the USSR to deny the famine occurred. This continued all the way up until at least the Andropov era. That's over 50 years of denial. So such authentic photographs are hard to find. This is why if you go around looking for such photos, you'll almost always end up with the same dozen or so Wienerberger collection. The great victory that this book accomplishes is that nothing said in it is entirely false. It simply throws seeds of doubt to draw your eyes away from what is relevant, and saturate your mind towards dead ends and bad historiography. One of those being the common claim of a natural famine. To put it mildly, there is no such thing as a natural famine in modern history. Of course, weather certainly plays a role, but famines are as much a factor of societal structures as they are natural processes. The potato famine in Ireland, for example, could be considered a natural famine by some, due to the blight. But the widely agreed upon reason behind such wide-scale devastation was due to matters of human control. Put simply, the British. In the case of the USSR, Soviet actions played a defining role in the scale and severity of what occurred. They were a factor that could have been changed or done differently. They were not unavoidable. For a book with famine in the name, only a very small section talks about the exact causes. If you're familiar with the topic, you can probably guess who receives the primary blame: our good old friends, the Kulaks, or wealthy landowners, who, in response to their land being seized, destroyed their crops and livestock. I'm afraid to tell you that this kulak line is largely an excuse, an exaggerated scapegoat used to throw away any blame. I've yet to find a reputable historian accepting culling and hoarding as a direct cause or even significant factor to the famine. For context, the calamity occurred in 1932-33. Yet the killing of livestock in large numbers was constituted majoritively in 1930. There were no signs of a famine then. The factor which was consistent throughout this period, however, was the Soviets' requisitioning of grain. Beyond that, there comes the question of what constitutes a kulak anyway. Certainly there were large landowners, who had grown over the past 20 years in part due to the Stolypin reforms. But these Soviet definitions would change consistently as time went on, and it was extended to simply middle-class farmers, former peasants who were no longer beholden to the land, and many people were constituted kulaks for simply not doing as they were told by the authorities. Kulak resistance is also diminished in the example of Kazakhstan, a land made up historically by semi-nomadic pastoralists and not landlordism. The Kazakh collectivization drive was a lot swifter than in Ukraine, with the majority of pastoralists being collectivized by 1931, with efforts to fully sedentarize the population within the next 2 years. And despite this, there was also an enormous death toll and near complete collapse of the livestock sector, despite little sabotage being conducted. The final insinuation of the narrative focuses on the fascist involvement with the famine. I don't want to understate the influence that Nazi propaganda has, and its pervasiveness even into the present day. It's no doubt true that in pursuing anti-communism, many exaggerations have manifested in popular discussion, so we ought be careful. At its most charitable, then, the book simply highlights that at the time it was written, a lot of the intentional genocide talking points were apparently being pushed by collaborationist immigrants. Canada does oddly have a lot of Nazi memorial, presumably as a result of such émigrés creating false narratives in their heads. If that's true, so be it. But the genocide question is not primary here. We know that millions of people died. When looking at contemporary fascists, Rudolf Nahony was the ambassador to the USSR at the time of the famine, and he considered the collectivization drive in a positive light, as a necessary endeavor to drag the backwards masses to a new degree of development. He, along with various other officials, placed more blame on the peasants themselves as opposed to the government action. But I need to add that whatever is true, there's a difference between exaggeration exists and it doesn't matter because the Nazis spoke about it. Opportunism alone doesn't answer for the validity of an event, simply that it was used for their own purposes. Politics is messy. In the years since then, there has been a national galvanization around Holodomor as part of modern Ukrainian identity. This has unfortunately led to the trend of many Ukrainian nationalists who are none too privy to being sly opportunists promoting any source that can bolster their cause, even going into open anti-Semitism and parading Ukrainians as the sole victim of the collectivization process. I'm no fan of this in the slightest, yet I'm also not surprised by it at all. Is it really too difficult to understand the phenomena of reaction against someone's desires to demean and discredit a nation's history, and or deny that certain events occurred? Look at the way current Russian agendas have been displaying Ukraine for some time now, as an integral part of Russian history, describing Ukrainians as little Russians, as a land of Nazis and addicts. What might be the reaction to those who identify with Ukraine? One could make the argument Ukrainian nationalism is the unfortunate price to pay for the sins of Russification. When it comes to historiography, the historians are by and large agreed on a free-peace consensus. The famine occurred, millions perished, and that it was due to Soviet actions. Only a few fringe individuals like Mark Torger insist upon natural famine narratives, but this is coming from the same guy who believes that the Bengal famine and the Irish famine were also natural, so whatever. No matter how many ways you try to slice it, the bulk share of the blame will always lie with Soviet authorities, because they're the ones who undertook collectivization through a haphazard, poorly executed back-and-forth central plan, demanding higher quotas and requisitioning grain and livestock beyond supply with little regard to those who were affected. This led to infrastructural shortages and migration. When you place this in conjunction with poor weather, it gives you all of the ingredients needed for a famine. Despite it appearing like all these factors are simply playing cards thrown down by Marxist-Leninists, there is a time and place for impartial discussion and research into them in the name of transparency. I'm sure it can be done. One that interests me is the mainstream notion that the Kulaks were successful peasants. I mean, success is a loaded term that socialists especially should not be buying into. Oskar Schindler was an unsuccessful businessman, until he got access to slave labor. And of course, Ukrainian nationalist sentiments should be a cause for concern irregardless of how they came to be. It's just that there is more than enough evidence to showcase where the main problem lies, and when you're presenting these arguments as a way to excuse wrongdoing, then you're just muddying the water. Like I said last time, half-truths will only create more false narratives. I mentioned earlier that Holodomor discourse has all the hallmarks of historic negation. And this is above all what interests me so much about this topic. If you're not familiar, negation can be thought of as a broader understanding of denialism. After all, very few people outright deny controversial events in history. They more than often inflate or deflate figures, create suspicion, debate intent, repurpose quotations, etc. And this has the effect of obscuring the picture as so that multiple contrasting elements can be believed at the same time, as long as they serve the purpose of deflecting blame. The thought process can be boiled down to a highly narcissistic playbook. It didn't happen, and if it did, then they deserved it. Again, let it be remembered, this topic was repressed by Soviet history for over 50 years. Then, when this information came to the surface, all of a sudden we get a different line downplaying the events. This should raise your eyebrow. It might be somewhat understandable during the late 80s for this book to have some credibility to some extent, but we live in the 21st century now, and there's been a lot more written about the Holodomor than simply Robert Conquest. Attitudes similar to the Holodomor are found in the Katyn massacre, that war crime I mentioned previously where 22,000 Poles were killed by the NKVD in newly occupied territory. Quacks like Grover Furr like to argue that this was a Nazi attack framed on the Soviets, despite them admitting to it in their swan song and no documentation being found after 1940. Most Marxist-Leninists currently appear to take this line, but those who aren't able to outright deny the event instead switch to saying that such victims were anti-communist and a threat to Soviet security, so therefore it was okay to kill them. There we go again. This is another common line we'll see throughout this series, so keep it in mind. A good question you might want to ask yourself when it comes to these topics in Soviet canon is, would I agree with popular denial of any other event? Perhaps one that didn't have such a socialistic tinge attached to it. Because there are plenty. Take the Japanese, who still downplay their atrocities in Nanjing. Or the Serbs, who will trivialize the Bosnian massacres. Israelis and Zionists deny the Nakba. And my God, you try talking to Turks about Armenians. I have. And it's sobering to realize just how universal all of this is. Why are these people being so obviously foolish? But when it comes to similar sentiments from the Soviet perspective, must these all be lies and slander? I'm willing to bet that a lot of you haven't even read a single article on the Armenian genocide. The intentions might not be the same, but the negation certainly is. In part 3, we will be going over the enduring legacy of the Kronstadt Rebellion. Get your pitchforks ready.